Okay, well, we should really get started because it's after 5 o'clock, and I want to make sure everyone gets their full hour of CLE credit. So thank you so much for coming this evening to this CLE. We are going to talk about election law. It's Election Law 2016, Voters' Rights and Election Procedures in Pennsylvania. I want to thank Reed Smith, BNY Mellon, and the American Constitution Society for sponsoring the CLE tonight. My name is Sara Rose. I'm a staff attorney at the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I work here in Pittsburgh. With me tonight are John Pashchinsky and Mike Healy. They are both lawyers here in Pittsburgh and experts in election law. So the purpose of tonight's CLE is twofold. One is to provide information, educate you about Pennsylvania election law. The other is to encourage you to volunteer with Election Protection. Election Protection is the nation's largest coalition of nonpartisan voter protection groups. And the purpose of election protection is to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate in the election process. So we are involved in, ACLU of Pennsylvania has been involved in election protection since 2004. I've been working on it since 2008. And we would like to encourage you to volunteer with us. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about volunteer opportunities at the end of the program. In addition, we will have a reception downstairs on the 12th floor following the program. And I would encourage everyone to attend that. And if anyone has any specific questions about volunteering, I'd be happy to talk to you then. So we're going to start off with just, Mike's going to give us an overview of voting rights law, and then we're going to move into Pennsylvania-specific election law. We're going to briefly cover registration, absentee ballots, and then we're going to have a more thorough discussion of the law that applies to voting on Election Day, including the law protecting voters from intimidation at the polls and what can be done when things may go wrong on Election Day. So, Mike, can you get us started with an overview of voting rights?
Yeah, when we talk about election law, we're really talking about it. Can you hear me?
It's great. So just press the button.
It's going on and off. Yeah. When we talk about election law, we're really talking about a patchwork of laws. And election law in this country is really kind of balkanized. We have sort of three systems. And I'm going to describe just very briefly, and then we'll get into the specifics of Pennsylvania election law. There's federal election law, and you can look at some of the amendments to the U.S. Constitution that gave African Americans and the freed slaves after the Civil War the right to vote. The 1920 amendments that gave women the right to vote, the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s, which expanded voting rights, and then the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in the wake of the hanging Chad issues that occurred in Florida in the 2000 election between Gore and Bush. The Help America Vote Act is sort of known for a couple things in general. One is a requirement to put in place different kind of voting machines, mostly electronic voting machines across the country. Although, so people understand this, not a requirement that there necessarily be a paper trail for those voting machines. So in some places there's a paper trail for the voting machines, in other places there is not. There were other provisions put in the Help America Vote Act providing for provisional ballots and particular procedures on Election Day. And then you have sort of the counties, and in Pennsylvania you have 67 counties. Every county does things, well, they try to get it right a little bit differently. So in election protection work, depending on where you are, we're interacting with 67 different counties. Most of them get it right, some get it wrong sometimes, and frankly, most of the issues we have are not things that we would call intentional voter suppression. It tends to be machines break down, or poll workers didn't go to the training, they're not sure how to zero out the machines, they're not sure how to turn on the machines and things like that. So that's the very, very broad framework. The state law for voter protection is contained in the the state code and the pertinent statutes. Most of what we talk about today is going to be the state law.
The only thing I want to add to the introduction is, as Mike told you, there are 67 counties in Pennsylvania, each of which do things slightly differently. One of the things we're going to talk about today is what the law says, but a lot of what happens at the individual polling places relates to the way things get done there. And that's not necessarily bad or wrong as long as it's fair and everyone's playing on an equal footing. And we'll try to point some of those out. But we're not necessarily saying that every letter of the law needs to be enforced as written at every polling place.
Okay, so the way we're going to structure this is Mike's going to give us a little bit of an overview on voter registration, and then we'll have some Q&A after each section, and that would be a time if anybody has any questions to ask your questions. So.
You've probably seen people on the streets registering people to vote, different various groups. Or on the downtown streets, they're at shopping malls and things like that. The voter registration is October 11th in a few days, so there's a big rush for people to get voter registrations in. So the people doing it on the street are doing the paper registrations. For the first time in this election cycle in Pennsylvania, people can register online through the Department of State. And it is our understanding is there's been a great deal of registrations online. Pennsylvania did not have that in the past. Here's the sort of broad brush in terms of what you need to register. You've got to be a citizen of the United States for at least 30 days prior to the election. To vote in Pennsylvania, you've got to be a resident of Pennsylvania and the election district you're voting in for at least 30 days. Where that comes up most often in Pennsylvania is in two situations. Someone moves for the first time, they're voting in a voting district. And the question often comes up, can they vote in their old voting district or their new voting district? Generally, if you go to the wrong voting district, you can vote there one time, and then you've got to vote in your new voting district in the future. The other situation that comes up a lot is students. What's the residency of a student? Is a student from New York State, are they a resident of, just throwing this out, Syracuse, New York, or are they a resident of Pittsburgh when they're going to the University of Pittsburgh? That's a common issue. If they register here, they make at least 30 days prior to the election, they make clear their intent that this is their residency, they can vote here. In Oakland, at SAMU, Pitt, and some of the universities, that's often an issue. It's been a huge issue at Lincoln University and Cheney on the other sides of the state. And every election cycle, there are issues, and we're in court on those things. You have to be at least 18 years old to vote. And you should register to vote at your current address to make things simple. If you're not sure about your registration or where you should vote, people can now call, and people often wait till the last minute, but now people can call 1-800-OUR-VOTE. And
1-866-OUR-VOTE.
Oh, I'm sorry, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. I'm still stuck on the old 800 numbers. And people can confirm their registration and confirm the place that they should vote. It's been a useful tool, and people who do voter registration work, whether they're working on the phones or at a poll or just monitoring, most of the questions you'll get that day have to do with that issue. Where do I go vote? How do I find out? And things of that nature. Voter registration, you can do it online through PennDOT. You can do it by paper. And the deadline is October 11th. And if you know people who haven't registered and people are asking about that, tell them don't wait till October 11th. There's often a flood of registrations coming in. The boards of elections in the major counties have hired additional staff to process the registrations and to process things like absentee ballots.
So, Mike, I have a question about voter registration, which is, what do you do? Where do you vote if you move 2 weeks before an election?
If you it moved 2 weeks prior to the election, you can go to your old polling place and you can vote there, and you can vote there once, but in future elections you've got to go to your new polling place. One issue that often comes up when people show up at the wrong polling place, the election judges can go on what we call a sure database, and they can tell people where their voting place is. And if they're in the wrong place, the election workers will let you vote by what we call provisional ballot. Now, we don't suggest people do that. We suggest people go to the right voting area, because a provisional ballot is just what it means. It's provisional. It may count, it may not. If you want it to count, you've got to come up, and they only really count them if they're going to be maybe determinative in certain races, and you don't know that until late the night of the election. There are actually hearings. People have to come into the election board, establish certain things. Most people don't want to do that. So most of the time, provisional ballots are a waste. We suggest people get to your right voting area so your vote counts.
Okay. Pennsylvania statute defines residence for purposes of voter registration as that place shall be considered the residence of a person in which his habitation is fixed, and to which, whenever he is absent, he has the intention of returning. So that sounds like, for us lawyers, a subjective test. You know, what do you consider your address as being fixed, and if you leave, do you intend to return there? So wherever you think you live can be used and you actually live there, can be used as a residence. Now, one problem I remember from the past couple of presidential elections with voter registration, and once again it was primarily with students, is many students came downtown to court and to the offices where lawyers were assisting one candidate or the other, wanting to vote but not having registered yet, and they all thought that they could register on the day of election. You cannot. You don't need to. If you get a question like that, you don't need to check with people unless they registered before the close of registration. They're unable to vote.
John, you want to move us on to absentee ballots?
Absentee ballots. Okay, absentee ballots are a means for people to vote who are unable to go to their poll on election day. And so Pennsylvania defines what types of people are eligible to vote by absentee ballot. And here's one of those areas where the statute says one thing, but the practice is often something else. So just to give you some examples of who's eligible to vote by absentee ballot are people serving in the military, families of people serving in the military, people who are out of the country can register by absentee ballot. Now the statute, the one that's causes the most issue in terms of where the law is not actually followed to strenuously. Now I'm going to read you what the statute says. Any qualified, registered, and enrolled elector who expects to be or is absent from the municipality of his residence because his duties, occupation, or business require him to be elsewhere during the entire period the polls are open, et cetera, et cetera. So what that means to me is people who, let's say residents of Pittsburgh, if you work outside of Pittsburgh and you're going to be out of the city during the entire time the polls are open, you can vote by absentee ballot. But if you work in the city and still work, your hours of work prohibit you from getting to the polls, the way the statute's written, it appears that you are not eligible to get an absentee ballot. However, there's just a form to fill out, and no one really checks whether you're filling out correctly. But you do have to sign on oath that you were qualified to vote by absentee ballot.
Yeah, and there's one sort of tricky thing on absentee ballots. We talk about absentee ballots. Pennsylvania does not have early voting. Many states have early voting at the different voting locations. Absentee, Pennsylvania does not have that. How absentee ballots get counted or don't get counted, when the absentee ballots come in, they're sent out to the precincts that the voters are from on election day. Sometimes voters decide they're going to go vote in person and they've already voted by absentee ballot. And sometimes they forget, sometimes they just spaced out. So what happens in those situations, the election judges, they have a list of the absentee ballots in front of them. If there's an absentee ballot and the person shows up to vote, the absentee ballot will be taken out and they'll vote on the machine.
Yeah, where that happens most frequently, I think, is when someone thinks they're going to be out of town. And so in advance, they file an absentee ballot, and then it turns out they're back home. And if they're like me, I still get a thrill out of pushing the lever or the button, and so they'll want to go vote in person. And so then the absentee ballot should be discarded. But there's a process to get an absentee ballot. There's a written application that has to be completed, and that must be received by the election department this year by 5 p.m. on November 1st. That's the application. That once you fill out an application, a ballot is mailed to your home or whatever address you use, and then you complete it and mail it back in or drop it off in person. But the deadline by which an absentee ballot must be received by the county this year is 5 p.m. on November 4th.
And that's the Friday before the election.
So no more absentee ballots after 5 p.m. November 4th.
I think that leads us to our next topic, which is what do you do if you find out after the deadline for applying for an absentee ballot that you're not going to be in the municipality? For example, you find out the Saturday before the election that you have to go out of town on election day.
Or you get sick and are in the hospital.
Correct.
Okay.
Sure. There are two different kinds of emergency absentee ballots. And this is important in Pennsylvania because, like we said, we do not have no excuse absentee ballots. So you can't, thinking you might be out of town is not really enough to qualify you. For example, if you are, we've had this situation before, where if you are pregnant, you might go into labor on election day, but you might not. That's probably not sufficient under the law to vote by absentee ballot. So instead, you've got to use an emergency absentee ballot. Lost my slides here, so I just want to wake that back up. So to get an emergency absentee ballot, there's two different ways. So one is if you find out on after 5 p.m. on November 1st, but before 5 p.m. on November 4th, if you find out you're not going to be able to make it to the polls, then you can submit an application, has to be notarized, but you submit it to the County Board of Elections. They give you a ballot, and then you return that to the County Board of Elections. If you find out after 5 p.m. on November 4th, but before 8 p.m. on November 8th, then you have to request that absentee ballot application from the Court of Common Pleas. And you have to have somebody appointed as a runner for you who can bring the application from the court to you. You have to fill out that application, have it notarized, and then have that appointed representative take that application back to the Court of Common Pleas, where the court decides whether you are entitled to an absentee ballot. If they decide that you are, then they will send that absentee ballot through your authorized representative back to you. You fill out the ballot, then that authorized representative has to take that back to the Court of Common Pleas. So it's a pretty lengthy and onerous process to get an emergency absentee ballot. And and so one of the things that we have done through election protection in the past is actually started in 2008 after there was a contingent of women at McGee Hospital who were in the maternity ward, and we were trying to get them to able to vote by emergency absentee ballot. Ended up having to go to court, get an order for them to return their ballots late because of all the difficulties in getting those ballots notarized. So anyway, in 2012, we actually had a project with area hospitals where we had volunteers in the hospital who had these applications ready, who could work with hospital patients who wanted to vote by emergency absentee ballot, had notaries ready, and we're hoping to do that this year too. So that's one of the projects we're hoping to get volunteers for, is to work with the UPMC and AHN hospitals to work with volunteers who are there, or actually have volunteers who, are volunteer stationed in the hospital, so that they can educate patients about the ability to vote by absentee ballot, and make sure that they follow all the steps, because it's quite a difficult process for someone who already is in the hospital to have to accomplish on their own. But it's important, because if you don't do it, then you absolutely cannot vote. And so, Mike, I want to ask you, what if somebody finds out that their polling place is inaccessible? Is there a way for them to vote?
If your polling place is inaccessible, you can get what's called an alternative ballot. Now, having said that, that's been a huge issue in the past in Allegheny County. It's much better now. There are only a handful of inaccessible polling places in Allegheny County. Now, having said that, we go over to the other side of the state. About half the polling places are inaccessible in Philadelphia right now. So it is still a huge issue. There's a court order to change that. Some of the inaccessibility is stairs, curbs, and things of that nature. Some of it's like the polling places are in the city, the parking's just not there, and it's a huge issue. It's getting better. And they'll be taking steps to deal with it, but it's something we worry about, because in Philly, and there's a project to deal with it in Philly. Philly, a lot of disabled people are going to have trouble voting still.
And what if somebody finds out, somebody uses a wheelchair, they get to their polling place and the elevator is not working and the polling place is on the second floor?
They can always, if they can get to downtown Pittsburgh, go into election court, they can vote through that way. It is a huge problem. We would encourage, hopefully we'll have enough signs up that people will know to call the 1-866 Our Vote number, and volunteers will respond to that and deal with that situation.
Aren't the various districts, the election board, supposed to have a certain number of paper ballots?
Yes.
So also at each polling place, there's supposed to be several paper ballots, and if there's someone who can't get into the polling place, if they can make the accessibility issue known to the people inside, they should be given a paper ballot to complete. And that should be counted with the regular votes, not a provisional vote or anything. The paper ballot is counted as a regular ballot. So that's one way of dealing with the accessibility issue, is making paper ballots available to people who can't get into the voting room.
And the County Board of Elections is going to give us a list of their inaccessible places before the election, so hopefully we can anticipate that.
Okay, so let's move on to problems that may occur on Election Day itself. Mike, you want to, or John? No, you're starting us off, right, Mike? Yeah.
Let's go start.
So Election Day, and when you're doing election protection work, whether you're in a call center or you're out in the field, most of your calls, most of the issues are going to pop up in the first couple hours. The most common issue we have is people show up at their polling place, they can't get the machines on, so in that situation, people can vote by the paper ballots that John talked about. But on Election Day, the polls are open from 7 a.m. in the morning to 8 p.m. at night. And on Election Day, you probably heard of the voter ID case that Pennsylvania had. In Pennsylvania, in a general sense, people do not have to show photo ID to vote, with one major exception. If you're a first-time voter, and if you're a first-time voter, even if you're a long-time voter, but it's your first time in this particular election precinct, you have to show an ID to vote. There are many different kinds of IDs. It could be a photo ID, it could be student ID, employee IDs. It can be a utility bill from your home that shows that John Smith, I reside at this particular address. In other states, there are still voter ID issues. Long story short, after Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was repealed and the pre-clearance things were eliminated, 17 states passed restrictions on voting. 2 states passed restrictions on voting within 24 hours of the repeal of Section 5. So there's a good deal of voter ID litigation going on across the country. The courts are looking more closely at the voter ID restrictions that are coming out across the country. There's no voter ID requirement in the state of Pennsylvania except for first-time voters. Election day, I will tell you a story. Election day 2008, we got calls from 3 counties that election machines are down all over the place. We thought it was a vast conspiracy to shut down the vote. What it turned out, it was in these particular counties, many of the election workers had not been trained, didn't know how to turn on the machines, and there were lines showing up. When I talk about training, so the election judges are all volunteers. At every polling place, there's an election judge who's kind of in charge. Then there's a minority and a majority person. So there's people from each each side. And then candidates have a right to have observers inside the polls so long as they have poll watcher certificates, that they have IDs. The equipment is the big problem. The resolution was we're doing a bunch of injunction hearings by telephone. It turned out it was equipment malfunctions or they couldn't turn it on. Technicians are sent out to deal with the machine. So if you're doing this stuff on election day and this happens, we call the county election people. They have roving technicians ready to respond to those situations. The other situation that happens, there are always 2 or 3 locations where the election judges, they have all the materials, they don't show up. And that becomes a problem. So we have to get the sheriff and get people in and get things going quickly. Because even a delay of a half hour to an hour at certain polls, it could be 100 people, 200 people. And people are like I am. I don't like to stand in lines. They're not going to come back. I mean, that really is a huge issue.
And that might be another instance where the paper ballots can be used is if there's a machine breakdown and while they're waiting for the technician to come, the election board people there would have the option of giving people paper ballots, assuming they have sufficient number of ballots available.
Yeah. The other thing that comes up on election day, we've talked about provisional ballots, and provisional ballots don't really count. And I mentioned that poll watchers for the campaigns, they have poll watcher certificates. They can be inside the election polls. They have a limited right to challenge the eligibility of voters to vote. There are 2 reasons they can challenge, and there are limitations on this. There are 2 reasons they can challenge the right of people to vote. One, on the basis of identification. You say you're John Smith. I know John Smith. You're not John Smith. You say you're a resident of Hobart Street in Squirrel Hill. I know you don't live there. In that situation, the voter has 2 options. They can vote by provisional ballot, which probably ends up not being counted. They can get another voter from the precinct to come in with them and say, I know this person. This is John Smith. He lives at this particular address, and that person should be allowed to vote. The other restriction on challenges is that the challenges can't be exercised in such a way that it's creating lines or disruptions. And election judges have a right to kind of try to calm things down. So if a particular poll watcher is challenging everybody, or challenging everyone of a particular sex or race. That's an issue we'll take to court, and we'll be in election court. Judges tend to be pretty good. Most of the election judges on the local site are pretty good, but if we have to go into election court, we're often in election court within an hour or so. But if it takes an hour or two, there could be 100, 200 people that don't vote. The lines get backed up, they walk away. So one of the things we look for on election day, are there patterns of this stuff in particular counties or cities? And do we need to go to court on a broad basis, or are these just isolated situations? They usually are isolated. On election day, I don't think it's as big an issue in Pittsburgh. In some parts of the state, the ballots may be in different languages, particularly Spanish. The one issue that comes up with disabled voters is disabled voters, upon signing an affirmation or certificate, have a right to have assistance if they need assistance to vote. So these are touchstone screens. If the person has cerebral palsy or can't use the touchstone screens, they have a right to have assistance in voting with two major exceptions. The person assisting them cannot be their employer or representative of the employer, nor can the person assisting them be a union representative. That comes up from time to time. In Allegheny County, it's been relatively decent. We haven't had serious issues about that, but it will come up. We always do get questions. Usually they're resolved pretty easily.
I have a question for you, Mike, and then I want to comment on the voter assistance. Now, you said there's two types of challenges, identity and residence. We talked about how there may be a number of registered voters who are not eligible because they're not U.S. citizens. Is it appropriate to challenge a voter on the basis of challenging their citizenship?
The statutes don't specifically address it, but I would think that would be a proper challenge. I'm not sure where those challenges go, but there's a burden on the person challenged to at least prove something. And in certain types of ballots, they're a challenge. If you challenge and your challenge fails, you may have to pay like $10 for every failed challenge. I think they do that in some places with absentee ballots.
Now, Mike said that there's a procedure to follow when a person with a disability would like assistance in voting, and here's an instance where the local practice may differ from the statute. You might see at local polling places where the people who work the polls, meaning the actual election board, not campaigners, know the families and know someone has a disability and just looks the other way when a family member or friend goes to assist the person with a disability. And that's one of those areas where I said local practice may trump the statute. You'd have to decide for yourself whether you want to insist on strict adherence to the statute when it just appears that people know by common sense that someone needs assistance. For example, I have a sister who has mental retardation who loves to vote. My parents always assisted her. No one ever challenged my parents' right to help her vote. It was fairly apparent that she needed assistance, and no one cared. But and I think that happens on pretty much large scale with in areas where everybody knows each other.
Yeah, I do believe there is a mechanism, though, for people who need assistance voting to have it actually noted on their voter registration card, so that it would actually be noted in the poll book for poll workers to see. So one issue that comes up a lot on Election Day is people go to their polling place and their names are not in the poll book. What should they do if that happens?
Well, as Mike mentioned earlier, the first thing that should happen is that the people who are running the election board should check with the county system. Mike, what was the name of that?
The SURE system.
The SURE system, to see if the person's registered to vote. And if the name is not at the local polling place but is in the SURE system, then they should be permitted to vote normally.
And what has happened historically sometimes, particularly in election cycles where there's been massive amounts of registration. So people register to vote in an election, and they're put in these lists. And sometimes if the local boards of elections are understaffed, those names don't make it to the poll book. So the election judges at the local site should be calling back to the county board of elections, then call back to the state database. It's a little better than it used to on 2004 and 2008, there were serious problems with that, especially in student areas at the University of Pittsburgh and CMU. And what happened in conjunction with that, the counties typically decide how many machines to put into place based on the historical experience of the voting. Like, we had so many voters in this cycle and that cycle, and this number of machines is right. Students don't vote in off-year elections. We get to presidential elections, and the lines are out the door. So in 2004, students were standing in line in Oakland, Pitt at CMU for 3, 4, 5 hours. The county, since then in presidential year elections, has done two things that helps it. They brought more machines in, and they do what's called split the poll book. So when you go in to vote, you're handed a card, they check you in, and it's all alphabetized, and they split the book so there's 2 lines instead of 1 lines. They move people through quicker. There will still be lines at Pitt and CMU. They're dealing with it better than they used to. Some parts of the state, it's still a problem. It's a problem at Penn State. It's a problem at Lincoln and Channing universities. And, that's just something we deal with every cycle.
Now, if we go back to the hypothetical and the local election board checks with the SURE system and there's no record of the person having registered, the person can still vote by, and they're insisting that they registered. They should then be given a provisional ballot. They can complete the provisional ballot, and then after Election Day, if they can prove that they have in fact registered on time by perhaps producing a voter registration card they had left at home. If they can prove that they were in fact registered, then the provisional ballot should count. If they can't prove that they registered, then the provisional ballot will not be counted. Anything else?
So what happens if it's 8 o'clock and the polls are closing and there's still people waiting in line outside the polling place?
And I don't recall if it's by statute, the practice has always been that anybody in line at 8 p.m. is permitted to vote. And I know that was a 2004, 2008, or 2004. There were so many people at the universities. Lawyers succeeded in getting a court order from a common pleas judge to extend the voting hours at certain polls. But anyone in line at 8 should be permitted to vote. They could stop the line at 8 o'clock, however.
Yeah, and if you happen to be doing voter protection work and that situation comes up, we encourage people, and sometimes the lines are very long. There might be 100 people. That who's ever doing voter protection work should stand. The person who's there at 8 o'clock should stand at that point. The official election worker should be sending someone to stand at that point. So some of those people, it may take a half hour. There's always a few polls where there's been some problems or delays. So some of those polls, it may take a half hour to an hour after the 8 o'clock closing time for people to actually get in and vote.
Now, a number of people who work the election boards recall they will have been there since before 7 o'clock in the morning, and they have to get there before 7 because they have to get the machines ready and turned on to receive the first voter at 7 o'clock. By 8 o'clock at night, they're exhausted. They want out of there. They want that martini. They want to go home and put their feet up. And now someone's telling them there's 100 people outside in line. So they may start, people working election protection have to, if there's any move by the election board to close off before the last person has voted, they have to do something, whether it's to call downtown or whatever number they're given. But the boards are supposed to allow everyone to vote who was in line at 8 o'clock. And sometimes that's not an issue, but other times, like it's 7:45, people there working, they're starting to wrap up what's going on inside the offices, or I'm sorry, the polling places.
Okay, so let me just stop here and see if there's any questions about anything we've talked about so far. Ellie? And well,
I'll do my first question now.
You know what, I'm going to walk around with the mic because this is being recorded for the web, and I just want to make sure people can hear you.
All right, first question is the ADA applicable to voters, and so therefore the polling people have to provide whatever accommodations are required?
I think they have to accommodate a person with disabilities. Remember, reasonable accommodation has to be made under the ADA, and what's reasonable changes depending upon the circumstances. And the public accommodations provisions in terms of the physical layout of the building, as long as the building hasn't been renovated, the building may not need to be ADA compliant. But that's where the issue of providing a paper ballot to someone or some other accommodation has to be made.
I was thinking of a blind person coming by him or herself.
That's where you can have an assistant to go into the actual voting booth with the voter to push the buttons or to hit the touch screen where that person tells them to.
Yeah, I also think that they're supposed to have audio recordings so that somebody who is vision impaired would be able to vote at their polling places.
Is there any remedy for bad faith challenges? For instance, people that speak with accents. I mean, how do you prove your citizenship?
That's a great question. If you don't have passport and someone challenges you, how do you prove your citizenship? You can swear I'm a citizen of the United States. There are bad faith challenges, and they're repetitive. We can get court orders stopping them. So the judges will look for patterns if there's patterns. I will tell you honestly, the whole citizenship thing is going to be confusing. There was a Kansas case about to register to vote, you had to prove your citizenship. Well, the problem with that was if you couldn't get your birth certificate because wherever your records came from burned down, you can't get your birth certificate, you don't have a passport, I don't know how you prove your citizenship. So that's a potential issue. We know it's going to be an issue in Virginia because it's been raised already. We think it's going to be an issue in eastern Pennsylvania. So.
But is that a valid challenge?
Under the statute, no, but we're anticipating those.
So can't we argue it's not a valid challenge?
Yes. And there's a federal court case in Kansas that would support that.
I have 3 quick questions. Who's entitled to a poll watcher certificate? Do the machines in Allegheny County spew out a paper certification of who voted, of the vote rather? And who is allowed to assist? You said that union people and your employer are not allowed to assist. Who is allowed to assist?
Anybody.
Can a family member?
In terms of what the machines spew out, and every county gets to pick their voting machine. It's got to be an electronic machine. Some of them spit out paper trails, so if there's got to be a recount, there's a paper trail. Machines in Allegheny County do not have a paper trail, which is a potential problem. So if you've got to do a recount, all you can do is take out the cartridge from the machine and read the numbers on it. Now, fortunately, that has not been an issue yet. In terms of who can help, the restrictions are your employer, your representative of your employer cannot help. The union or representative of the union cannot help. A family member, a friend could help. Can
A poll watcher.
oh,
I don't think someone from the board. Let me look.
no, I don't think so. In regard to who gets a poll watcher certificate, the poll watchers are representatives of the campaign. So for example, in Pennsylvania, Hillary Clinton could, at every poll, Clinton could have a poll watcher. Trump could have a poll watcher. Katie McGinty could have a poll watcher. Toomey could have a poll watcher. And sometimes in some polls, there's a lot of poll watchers there. And it's up to the election judges to sort of keep them back and make sure they're not disrupting the flow of the voters. But every candidate for any office that affects that precinct, so there might be a local office, has a right to have a poll watcher as long as they have a proper poll watcher certificate. Yeah, the statute says the judges of election, the official poll workers, may not provide assistance to a disabled voter.
Question.
My recollection from the 2012 election was, and I've seen this in other jurisdictions, that frequently when a voter's name is not on the rolls at the poll, election workers either don't want to call at all or perhaps legitimately are getting busy signals or are being backed up and are unable to reach the county. I also recall that there's a public list that can be accessed with a smartphone. So is there a possible procedure where an election protection person can identify the person through their own smartphone on the list and then carry it to the election judge?
We have had election protection workers do that for poll workers who are amenable. One of the problems with the poll list, especially if a lot of people register at the end of registration, the counties don't update them, and they're supposed to have supplemental poll books. In 2012, we actually found a lot of those didn't actually make them to the polling places. And then the other thing that happened in 2012 is that SHORE database went down during the day, so you couldn't use the SHORE database to check on people's registrations. So I would encourage people, especially if you're a first-time voter at that polling place, one of the pieces of ID that you can bring is your voter registration card that you get in the mail. That's what you can use to show that you are a registered voter. So I would encourage people to take those with them because, one, you have to have some kind of ID, and that suffices, and two, it's proof of your registration.
So I have two questions. First, in terms of challenges, so far we've established affidavits, having somebody vouch for you, or provisional ballot is an option. Is providing additional identification, maybe photo ID, maybe not, is that a valid way of beating a challenge?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
It's one of many ways, yes.
Oh, okay.
So for inaccessible polling places or disabled voters, you describe what's essentially a curbside voting system. Are poll workers trained in that? Do they have distinct secrecy ballots from the provisional ballots so that those votes will actually be counted as an alternative ballot?
Poll workers are trained in that.
Theoretically.
Now, having said that, not all the poll workers show up. So the question was, are poll workers trained if disabled persons come to an inaccessible polling area? Sort of what happens. The poll workers are trained in that, but they may not have shown up to the training. They may think they're too busy. But people can come out with the paper ballots. It generally works. That is an issue we haven't had a lot of trouble with in Pittsburgh recently. In Philadelphia, it's a huge problem.
Okay, so I want to move on to voter intimidation because that's been a hot topic in Pennsylvania this election cycle. So, John, can you tell us some of the rules about voter intimidation at polling places, who's allowed to be in a polling place, things like that?
All right, let's start with what's allowed at the polling place. The only people in a poll should be the election board. That's the people who are working the poll for the county. The candidate's poll watcher, who has a watcher certificate, and the voters. Those are the only people who should be inside the polling place. There's to be no campaigning by an election board. If the people who are running the poll have candidate buttons on, that's an issue. Now, there's to be no political signs inside, and by political signs, I mean partisan signs, inside the actual voting room. There is supposed to be a sample ballot so that people can look on the wall at something to see what they're going to see when they go into the voting booth. If someone has highlighted names, that's an issue. Everything should be nonpartisan. Now, a person who goes into the voting room to vote is permitted to wear partisan material, T-shirt, button, whatever. That's their First Amendment right, and they have no indicia of governmental approval just because they're going in to vote. Now, one area where there's a difference in practice than what actually the law provides, there is the people who run the voting keep a tab of who has voted and how many people have voted. Many, many times when I have worked the polling place as a candidate, I have gone in to ask, may I see the list or how many people have voted, and have been allowed that, given that information. I would only do that when they're not busy, when no one's in the room voting, and I'm not trying to had not been trying to campaign against somebody. So to the extent someone goes in and asks a fairly innocent question, even though they are working for a candidate, if it has no way of influencing the vote, you may or may not care about it. Voting, no campaigning should occur within 10 feet of the 10 feet of the voting place. Now, I checked the statute yesterday because we had a discussion amongst ourselves as to whether that 10 feet means the building in which voting is occurring or the room in which the voting is occurring, and there's no case law that I could find that define polling place for purposes of being the room or the building. Typically, what I have seen in the past is people generally apply the 10-foot rule to the building, generally. Now, if someone goes 9 feet, is that an issue? I mean, you've got to apply some common sense. If it's raining out and all of the people who are working for the candidates say, let's go inside the door of the building, but stay away from the room in which the voting is taking place, is that a big deal? It may technically violate the statute, but once again, it's an even-handed rule that is allowing people to receive information and to vote. To the extent someone is actually at the door of the room, I would think that's a problem. Now, I got a question from Philadelphia last week about what the rule is regarding guns at voting places. There is absolutely no law in Pennsylvania that prohibits someone from having a gun at a polling place. However, no guns are permitted inside the courthouse. So if there's a polling place at a courthouse, however, a courthouse must provide a facility for checking in guns. That's required by Pennsylvania law. And schools, guns are prohibited from schools. So even though someone has a right to have a gun when they go to vote, if they're voting in a school building, they're not permitted. The law prohibits guns at a school. Now, the law that prohibits guns at schools, however, has an exception for other lawful purposes. And that phrase has never been interpreted by the court. So it's possible that someone would take a gun into a school and say, I want a gun for self-defense, which is a constitutionally protected reason for having a gun. Now, does that trump the school ban or not? And I don't know. So what I would suggest, if it's a school building, someone approaching the school building with a gun should be challenged, or you should go get the judge of elections to stop a gun from entering a school building. If it's a non-school building and there's a voter who has a gun and isn't waving it about or using it in a manner that appears to be designed to intimidate someone, let it go. Pennsylvania people are allowed to have guns, whether we like that or not. Let me get to the intimidation point.
We have a slight difference here.
Now, okay, Mike's got a difference. What is prohibited by statute is intimidating voters at the poll. And here are some examples of intimidation. It's by no means intended to be an exhaustive list. Asking voters for ID by someone other than an election official. So when we talked about challenges, the person who wants to make a challenge has to communicate that to the election official. The election official is the only one with authority to ask for identification. Excessive challenges by a poll watcher can be viewed as intimidation. Challenges that interfere with the flow of voters could be viewed as intimidation. Arguments and adversarial conduct inside of the polling place. Improper interactions with voters inside of the polling place. Any other conduct that would reasonably interfere with the voter exercising the right to vote. So, I'm no big fan of guns. I was trying to tell you what the law says. If you've got a group of people hanging outside the door of a polling place with guns, and it seems that that is intimidating people, that is intimidation. Mike, you had a...
Well, actually, I agree with that last point. I think if there are groups of people hanging out with guns, and if people with guns are just standing at the polls as people are coming in to vote, and this is really going to be fact-specific, and frankly, there are no Pennsylvania cases on this right now. I would argue it violates the statute. It is voter intimidation. I'm going to apologize. My friend Sarah here scheduled me for another voter rights talk at 6:30 in Squirrel Hill, so I've got to rush off to do it. John and Sarah are going to keep going.
See you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
All right. So you have to look at a situation and try to determine whether you think it is reasonably causing intimidation or designed to cause intimidation. And what could be done if it gets reported to the county, a sheriff can be sent out or a court order can be obtained to prohibit that conduct.
Okay, so I think we've gotten in our full hour of CLE. I just want to, make a final pitch for Volunteers for Election Protection. You all should have received this paper with your materials, which describes the pro bono opportunities to volunteer with election protection. Basically, what we need volunteers to do is to monitor different polling places. So what we do is we assign volunteers sort of a number of polling places within a certain geographical area and have you go to visit those polling places throughout your shift. And it'll either be, divided up, the day will be divided up into 2 or 3 shifts. So visit those polling places, help any voters that may need assistance, look for any problems that might be having, or if voters tell you that there are problems at that polling place. And also, we may ask you to investigate problems. So the way that the election protection program is set up in Pennsylvania is we have really 3 components. The first is the nationwide hotline. That's the 866 Our Vote number, 866 OURVOTE. There's also a Spanish language number and an Asian language number, and those are listed on this sheet. And so that's what voters can use to call if they have questions. Am I registered to vote? Where's my polling place? Any kind of question they might have about voting, they can call that number. It's actually being answered live even right now from, I think, the hours of 10 to 6. By the time we get to election day, it's going to be answered 24 hours a day. And then the other component is that all of those calls are monitored. So the volunteers in those hotline centers can flag any calls that they get that look like there might be a problem at that polling place. And then we will have command centers that we're setting up in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to where we have access to that database, and we can see all the problems that are being reported and respond to them. And so the way we'll respond to them is by relying on our field volunteers to go and investigate problems at those polling places if we have volunteers in that area. And do some fact gathering and talk to the voters there, talk to the poll workers, and then we will contact, depending on the level of severity, the County Board of Elections, and all the way to going to court. And in the past, I've done this in 2012 and 2008, and both of those elections we did have to go to court on some issues. So it's really set up, to help voters, but also to be able to respond very quickly to any problems that happen, so we can nip them in the bud and to make sure that people are not disenfranchised. Because, like Mike said, if there are really long lines at the polling place, or people are constantly being challenged, or there's people outside the polling place who are engaged in voter intimidation, that may prevent a large number of people from exercising their right to vote. And we want to make sure that everyone who is eligible to cast a ballot is able to do so on Election Day.